Welcome to the National Building Museum. I'm delighted that all of you were willing to come out of that glorious weather and join us today. But I think this is going to be a terrific program. My name is Rynd, and I have the honor of being the President and Executive Director of the National Building Museum. And it is our great pleasure to collaborate with the Canadian Embassy and the American Institute of Architects on this morning's program, What Would Jane Jacobs Do? 51 years ago, Jane Jacobs published her seminal book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which transformed how we look at the urban environment, design, and planning. Indeed, her very first sentence spelled out her intentions, and I quote, "This book is an attack on current city planning and rebuilding." She was responding to the imperial approach of master plans and proposed freeway construction through her beloved Greenwich Village. Generations of architects, planners, landscape architects, and city officials cherish their well-read copies of this book dating back to early in their careers. This morning, we have gathered an impressive group of individuals to examine how Jane Jacobs continues to resonate today. In the conversation that follows, we will discuss urban renewal, historic preservation, mixed-use development, and public space. Our panelists this morning include Thom of Thom Architects, designer of Arena Stage here in Washington, D.C. Harriet Tregoning, director of the D.C. Office of Planning. Developer John Zuccotti, co-chairman of the board, Brookfield Properties Corporation. And our moderator today will be Susan Szenasy, editor-in-chief, Metropolis. We would like to thank Brookfield Properties and the Canadian Embassy for generously underwriting this morning's program, and the American Institute of Architects for partnering with us on this event. And I must add a special welcome to those attending the 2012 American Institute of Architects annual meeting that's been occurring over the past few days. And finally, we would like to thank Ellen McCarthy, Director of Planning and Land Use at Arent Fox, and Joanne Newhouse, who's the Executive Director of the Penn Quarter Neighborhood Association. They will both be leading walking tours immediately after this program for those of you who pre-registered, and I understand that the tours are now full. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Deanna Horton, Minister, Congressional Public and Intergovernment Relations at the Canadian Embassy, to say a few words before this morning's program. Deanna?
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for coming out so early on Sunday morning. You may wonder why the Canadian Embassy is here today. First, while Jane Jacobs was an American, she left for Toronto in 1968, where she lived for the rest of her life, 2 blocks away from where I also lived in a downtown neighborhood of Toronto. Her activism in New York continued in Toronto, where Death and Life of Great American Cities provided a campaign platform to stop the Spadina Expressway. Jane also championed the use of streetcars. The old streetcars which still run in the streets of Toronto are a testament to her influence. The City of Toronto proclaimed Friday, May the 4th in 2007 as Jane Jacobs Day. At that time, 24 free walks around and about Toronto neighborhoods were started in her memory. Jane's Walk has since spread to 8 cities and towns across Canada and to many U.S. cities as well, but not Washington. Jane not only played an enormous role in the development of Toronto, she was active in cities across Canada. A former mayor of Calgary, Dave Francoeur, now the Alberta rep in Washington, recalls meeting Jane Jacobs and having to speak to her through an old-fashioned ear trumpet. In Calgary's Kensington neighborhood, developers are following a humanistic approach in designing mixed-use condominiums on a former church site. In Vancouver, Jane influenced the construction of residential high-rises built within Vancouver city limits, believing that high-density growth would lead to greater diversity, vital for city life, economic growth, and prosperity. She also influenced urban planning and growth in the city during the 90s, as she was part of a wholesale activist movement that promoted historically inspired mixed-use neighborhoods. Jane Jacobs was selected to be an officer of the Order of Canada in 1996 for her seminal writings, and thought-provoking commentaries on urban development. Jacobs famously discussed the need for old buildings to house new ideas. So hopefully today we will have lots of new ideas in this venerable old building. So I would like to thank Brookfield for sponsoring the event, all those who came to lunch at the inception of this project, and you know who you are, and most of all, Scott Kratz, who works with Chase Rynd and the NBM team. You are a great neighbor. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm really happy to see you all. How many of you are with the AIA? Oh, a few of you dare to stay. Have a great weekend here. So the first thing that we'd like to do is talk to everyone on the panel about what influenced them about Jane Jacobs' writing. But before we do that, I'd like to send a little appreciation to Jane wherever she is for saving Washington Square Park and not making it into a highway. I live just north of Washington Square Park now, and it is one of those incredible moments in urban life that enriches everything in the neighborhood. So the idea of a park, it's remade itself. It is now more modern than ever, but it is still the green spot and that kind of wonderful water and plantings and air that we need in density. So I wanted to give my thanks to Jane right now. And I would like to start let's go down the line with our panelists. So let's start with Mr. Zuccotti, the developer on the panel, to talk about how has Jane Jacobs influenced you?
Well, I'm here under somewhat confusing circumstances because I am billed as a developer, but I probably am here because I am the co-chairman of a great Canadian company in the United States, the largest owner of commercial real estate in the world, about 72 million square feet of space in North America alone. But I'm also here because of my own background, and also because my former law partner dragooned me into this, Marilyn Marconi, who's a successful developer herself here in Washington. Unbeknownst to anybody in this audience, I grew up 2 blocks away from Jane Jacobs' home on the corner of Perry Street and West Hudson. And so I was very sensitive to the things that she wrote about in her book, and I could tell you exactly what the neighborhood in which I grew up, about which Jane Jacobs wrote. It was indeed in the 1940s and 50s a working class neighborhood, primarily occupied by Italian Americans and Irish Americans who were working on the docks. At that time, that area of New York was completely covered with 3 things. First, on the waterfront, piers where there were commercial and other kinds of vessels coming in, passenger vessels. Secondly, a highway called the Miller Highway that blocked access to the water. The only access to the water was at a ferry pier at Christopher Street and the Miller Highway, which was also called the West Side Highway, a little bit like the Gardner Expressway. And finally, beyond that, was going eastward were all of the support functions, warehousing, manufacturing, and all of the kinds of support industrial and manufacturing uses related to the waterfront. In addition, further south were primarily areas of markets. 14th Street was the meat market. That was very close to where Jane lived, and south of that was the butter, cheese, and egg market, which now turns out to be probably the most expensive square foot real estate, residential real estate, now known as Tribeca. All these areas, just as a passing thing, are acronyms for areas, locational areas. Tribeca is the triangle below Canal Street. Soho is south of Houston. All of those names evolved in the 1960s and 70s.
So the lesson,
Pardon me?
The lesson of Jane and lesson of your neighborhood that you're describing.
Right. So,
how are you carrying it forward?
So the bottom line was when Jane Jacobs' book was written, I was a student at Yale Law School. And I went to a great law school that allowed me all kinds of license. I didn't produce necessarily lawyers for major Wall Street law firms. It produced lawyers who were supposed to take their place in public affairs. And in fact, my professor was another great developer who's probably another great planner who, in my view, sort of stands between Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs. His name was Edward Logue. At the time, he was very much involved in developing New Haven with the mayor Richard Lee. And he was on the faculty, and he was the man who I learned a great deal from. But the project that he conceived of, in addition to the urban renewal area, was a Worcester Square project. I recommend, if you ever go to New Haven, to go across the railroad tracks and see the Worcester Square project. It is exactly the kind of thing that Jane Jacobs would have believed should happen to a residential area in a small, middle-sized American city.
Okay, so we'll get into where your development...
Okay, so the bottom line is two things happened. I wrote what would be the middle operational paper for my graduation. It was called Some Tools for Mrs. Jacobs. And it was a book about how zoning could be used to carry out the objectives of diversity that she, in fact, aspired in her book. The biggest problem was how to figure out how to use zoning to get rid of the multiplication of shoe stores that were happening along 8th Street between 5th and 6th. I then, later on in life, became the chairman of the New York City Planning Commission, and that's where many of the ideas of Jane Jacobs became part of the policy of the city. For instance, New York City had adopted a process called the master plan, which was espoused by the Planning Commission. Subsequently, the New York City Planning Commission rejected its own master plan on the grounds that it lacked community participation and it lacked a sense of scale. And other things that happened when I was the chairman, we concentrated primarily on what we called mini plans. We developed a system of process for community participation in planning. We did a whole host of other things which, from my perspective, were based on my personal experience of living in that neighborhood, and secondly, the learning that I acquired working on Jane Jacobs' book.
Thank you. Thank you. Now for our Office of Planning in Washington, D.C., Harriet Tregoning, your lesson or your the influence of Jane Jacobs on you? Reading.
I love this book, and honestly, it's somewhat ironic, but I think I wouldn't be a planner today. I wouldn't be the head of planning if her book didn't suggest that you actually don't need to be professionally trained as a planner to love cities and to be able to help cities grow and evolve, and that in many ways, for me and for thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of millions of other people, Jane Jacobs is the decoder ring to great urban places. It helps people understand what it is that they like about places that they do like, and why it is that some places work and other places don't. And I think that with the renaissance that we're seeing in cities around the U.S., that there's sort of never been a bigger appetite, for what she has to say about places. I think her very simple way, a very direct way, very experiential way of talking about things that make cities work, make neighborhoods work, and at different scales. I think those are incredibly valuable lessons, and that and a great way to engage a whole new generation of urbanites who are returning to our wonderful cities.
Okay, so let's hear from the architect now. Being Thom, your work is in many places, in many cultures. It's not just Canada, but here in Washington, D.C., and then elsewhere. So you have maybe a personal learning lesson from Jane Jacobs?
Well, I was a student just starting architecture when the book came out, and that was the period where, at the height of the modernist movement, really. And I think the book has changed a whole generation of architects my age that really rebelled against the issue of buildings for their own sake, and really kind of reminded us that we really, have to design for people. I think for me that was the great lessons. And personally, 2 years later, I was a scholarship student visiting Washington and stood at Enfant Plaza and saw this wasteland of just desolation, and it actually made me so angry that it really literally changed my life. And we were a group of scholarship students from Canada visiting so-called great American cities to look at iconic great architecture, and we came to look at the IMP buildings on Enfant Plaza, and we actually all went on strike on the professor and demanded that we start looking at inner city neighborhoods. And credit to him, he did. He just rescheduled the whole 2 months tour that we were, and then we went up to look at really inner city neighborhoods. And it really, from that experience, influenced me a great deal about why I practice architecture the way I do. And the very fact that, we even to this day, I think we still forget that we are really designing the public spaces, that public spaces are really the living rooms of the citizens, and the buildings are actually just the backdrop for that, and the role of public service that, as architects, we have a monopoly to practice given to us by society, but our allegiance is not to the people who pay us. Our allegiance is really to the citizens of our country. And that's a role that I feel very strongly about and often forgotten within the professional realm.
So now that we have the Love Fest, we can, the Jane Love Fest, we can now, let's get real now. Because I think that we're all very much attracted to the connectivity, the human scale of Jane Jacobs. But in reality, our cities aren't built that way, or most of our cities aren't built that way, and most of our built environment does not reflect that understanding. Bits and pieces of them do, and they're beginning to a little bit more than before, but we have an extremely alienating urban culture that is on the ground right now. So maybe I'll start with Mr. Zuccotti here, because I was just downtown on Friday, and I'm telling you, there's always less of the sky down there. You can't see the sky, you can't see the ground, you have all those hard surfaces. The city is not made for people. So can you talk about these new developments that exist, and especially given that there's a park that bears your name that attracted the Occupy movement, that basically created out of a private space a public area that really did work as a Jane Jacobs ideal. But I mean, here it is as a kind of instrument of development. At the same time, it becomes the locus of public protest. I mean, can you talk about what's going on downtown right now that could multiply some of the things that Zuccotti Park has come to mean to the city, to people?
Well, Lower Manhattan right now is struggling to restore itself as a result of the attacks on 9/11. The principal focus of development is around the World Trade Center site, and a great deal of money has been spent to restore the outlining areas that were affected adversely, such as Chinatown and the area around the seaport, etc. In my view, however, when you say there is insufficient light and air in Lower Manhattan, and that's true, but remember, most of the buildings there were built, like the Equitable Building at the turn of the century, not this century, the prior century. The Equitable Building built in 1916 was the building that prompted the first zoning, attempted zoning in New York City, largely because of its impact on light and air. However, I think that a great deal has been done to improve the quality of life for people in Lower Manhattan over the last 40 years. I just put 3 things into evidence, and then I'll shut up because I could talk for hours about this. The first one is the conversion of existing office structures into residential structures. This has had a tremendous impact on trying to turn Lower Manhattan, as Jane Jacobs would have wanted, from a single-use daylight community to a 24-hour community. It is remarkable when I go to work at the World Financial Center to see how many people are with children are coming to the Battery Park City area and who are actually living on Wall Street in commercial buildings that have been converted. With that commercial building has come more retail. For instance, if you walk on Wall Street today, you'll see a hotel and a new retail shop. So that's the first. The second is Battery Park City itself, which I consider to be probably the greatest urban development project in the latter part of the 20th century, any place in the world. Because it provided a mixture of uses, commercial and residential, because it provided adequate recreational space, and because it envisioned the relationship of the river and the water to the upland area. If you walk from the north portion of Battery Park along the park-like area that goes all the way to the north portion to the park, the Battery Park, the base, you will have a fantastic urban water experience, unequaled in my view in the world. So I do not believe that living in Lower Manhattan is an oppressive situation. In fact, from a developer's point of view, the public votes with their rent. And in fact, the apartments at Battery Park City are in great demand because people want to live there because of the openness of the area, because of the recreational opportunities, because it has 2 very good schools. And on the whole, the vision of turning Lower Manhattan into a 24-hour community has been successful, and relating to Jane Jacobs, some of her ideas indeed were incorporated, such as the mixture of uses, the introduction of retail and commercial uses. That's what I would say.
So that's really interesting because Battery Park is indeed incredibly successful. You go out there on any weekend and the whole city is out there enjoying the water and the natural habitat that is there. However, it still doesn't make up for the density and the inhumanity of that downtown development that's going on right now. And I don't see any plans that show some understanding of Jane Jacobs in that dense quarter, and I understand that it is the early 20th century, late 19th century tall building phenomena. But to add so much square footage down there and then to make it a mixed use is, you think of little children living down there in those dark canyons. They have to run to Battery Park City to get some air. So I'm just, okay.
Well, we have a somewhat different perspective.
I knew you would. Okay, so let's go on to Washington, D.C., because I think there's some really interesting things going on in urban planning and development, Harriet, and you being a huge advocate of biking and connectivity and all of those things that we have learned through Jane Jacobs. Can you talk about some of the programs that you're working on and how are you shifting the dialogue in Washington, D.C. About maybe perhaps away from the car a bit and maybe more street life, more biking, more healthy, kind of getting around, more connectivity?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. I have to say this a lot, and I'll say it to all of you. I don't dislike cars. I have a car, I like to drive, and I think a healthy city actually accommodates all modes of travel. What I do think has happened is that particularly since the time that Jane Jacobs wrote this wonderful book, that most of our cities, the previous zoning code, the existing zoning code for our city is circa 1957. And it really does contemplate a city that more and more is built entirely around automobiles, which in so many ways is such an aberration, right? So for 6,000 years, human settlement patterns looked more or less the same, built on kind of walkable neighborhoods with your daily destinations and walking distance. But the infatuation with automobility at the exclusion of everything else really did a number on our cities, and for that matter on our suburbs. Really changing those settlement patterns very profoundly. So now, we're trying to, I think, get some balance back into cities so that we can accommodate those modes that made our cities so vibrant to begin with. What's so funny about Washington is if you look at it today, it looks pretty much like it looked 100 years ago. And if you see photos of Washington from 100 years ago, the streets are teeming with pedestrians. I mean, the sidewalks are choked with them. They're crowded with them. There's transit, there's other things, but there's bicycles, there's mostly pedestrians. And it's not as if our uses have changed so radically. I mean, what has been different is that auto manufacturers have spent $40 billion a year, year on year on year, telling us we are what we drive, and we have largely internalized that. So I think a lot of what we're trying to do in the city is giving people more choices about how to get around, and really trying to use more of the pleasure principle, making it really fun, interesting, and enjoyable to take those other ways of traveling. I mean, cities need it for their own health and prosperity, but we need it as people because it's so much more fun and refreshing to get around these other ways. It's so much better for us as human beings. We're built to walk. We're really not built to sit on cushioned seats, for 12, 18 hours a day and not sort of do anything else. So it's all, I think a lot of what we're doing in this city is to try to enable, more walking and more reasons to walk. So that means active street fronts, retail on the streets, the mix of uses that are so important, but saying mix of uses isn't enough. I mean, you have to get really much more detailed about the times of day and the comings and goings and all of that to really have an active street frontage. It means restoring some of our historic levels of population. Household sizes today in the district are half what they were when Jane Jacobs wrote this book, and how we shop and how we use retail, all totally different than before. So I think a lot of our efforts are really designed to try to bring back some of those ways of doing things, and yet, in a way that makes sense in a 21st century city.
Well, I think that is really a wonderful thing, and I am seeing signs of it, but I think you pointed something out here, which we're all victims and beneficiaries of, is the massive public relations effort by the automotive companies and the oil companies to push that one mono technology and push that way of travel that it's almost impossible to overcome. I mean, I'm all over the U.S. going into every city, and new parking garages are going up, roads are being widened. I mean, new suburbs are getting developed. So is this one of those kind of in-house things that we talk about, this Jane Jacobsian idea, or does this really have public traction, Harriet?
I think what's interesting is that we've just come through the Great Recession, right? Knock wood, hopefully we're through it, yeah? Places fared very differently around the U.S. Even within a region, places fared extremely differently. No one would have wanted to have an experiment, where we put our whole, economy and our property values on the line to make a bet about which kind of places are better places, but in fact, that is what happened. And the places that held their property value, the places that did well, the places that bounce back with the most resilience are those places, that are very much like what Jane Jacobs described. They have a mix of uses. They have housing and daytime activity. They have transportation choices. They have density. I mean, those are the places that did very well. So what you're seeing with the next generation, we're certainly seeing it here in Washington. It's lots and lots of people choosing to live in the city again for the first time in decades. So that's very exciting. For us, I think it's very exciting for cities overall, but I think it also suggests, that for people who really are concerned, every business person is concerned about the bottom line, that it makes sense, to really look at these lessons and to consider them when we build and when we invest and when we look at what we want to do going forward. Your point about how much building we've done since 1960 in this automotive focused manner of building, I think it's the challenge of our generation to figure out how to retrofit those places. You're in a city like Washington, you're doing much more small-scale, very careful intervention. I'm proudest of the streets we've reconnected here in the city in the last 6 years. Really brought back many of the l'enfant streets that had previously been part of super blocks or some other or urban renewal or something else. When it seemed like, oh, what the heck, we could develop on this land. Why would we want to keep it as a street for circulation? Isn't that a waste? But I think we are learning those lessons.
Your mic is going out.
Oh.
Okay, so there is sort of the principles of Jane Jacobs obviously go across national lines, and I think I'd like to ask Bing Thom this because you're building in so many places, and perhaps you can tell us. I mean, maybe I know what you're going to say, but I'll ask it anyway. So where is the most sort of the most interesting place that you're building where the Jacobs principles are alive and well and are helping to shape those urban environments in which you're building?
Well, it's Jane Jacobs actually had much more influence in Canadian cities than American cities. And my reason for doing so much now in Washington is because of my experience in working in China. Because Robert Moses is alive and doing very well in China. And whenever I went there and I talked about what they should do, they would say, well, other than Canada, where else have you done it? So I decided to come back to the United States, where I was educated, and here I'm doing it in the capital of the nation. And the shock of coming to the capital of the nation is the fact that you practice actually design and planning very differently in Canada. I think we developed within Canada a greater system of dialogue between the planning officials and the design officials, where much of our regulations are what we call discretionary, written in a discretionary manner rather than a prescription manner. I recently had meetings up in Montgomery County, and you go to planning meetings and the lawyer does all the talking, not the architect. And this law firm that we were working with had one of the lawyers just moved to Vancouver, and she came to see me last week, and I said, well, you're going to be out of work here because nobody's going to want to see you at the planning department because they'll have a heart attack the minute a lawyer walks in. But what's happened, I think, is we need to learn to talk to each other again, and I think the regulations, I've had chats with Harriet about this, that, I don't think Jane Jacobs in writing her book meant it in any way of prescriptive solution. I think what she was really reminding us to do is to think about every problem from a very fundamental level. Issues of density, issue of citizens' participation, issue of heights, issue of scales. The art of building city is an art, and any form of art requires a very I would say intense relationship between the client, the planning official, and the architect, designer, and the citizens. And that relationship has to be built on through a system of trust. not distrust. And I think so much of the regulation is telling you what not to do and is not focusing on what you should do. So if we can focus on figuring out at the very beginning of saying, well, what are the issues that we're all trying to do, sit around the table and figuring out how to get there. That, to me, was the big lesson for me about Jane Jacobs, is that she's reminding us that you have to build communities, and communities are made up of the people who together create the built environment, not any one single group. So that, to me, is the issue that I've learned, and in China, they don't have any of that. So that's why I do very little work in China now, because
So
there are no clients, like you never meet the client.
I
You
know.
build these empty vessels,
Yeah. So
and
Harriet has something to add, but I do want you, Bing, to say in your elevator speech, what is it that the Canadians are doing that is this sort of thing that we in the U.S. could learn from? In other words,
I think discretionary zoning is one of the big issues. Like we rewrote our whole zoning bylaws, I think back in the early 70s, that encouraged a lot more dialogue and a lot more interaction between the various parties. And I think that's the one lesson that you could learn here in the U.S. a bit more.
okay, Harriet.
It would be one thing if people came in to your office with their copy of The Death and Life, right? But these are not lessons learned. I mean, these are not widely accepted tenets. People might have read the book, but I don't think, it's not like I would say these ideas are winning, Even in a city like ours, where I think she could have written this book, she could write it today. That is not this is not the conventional wisdom of the people that come into my office, So yes, I totally agree that regulation is about preventing bad things from happening. It never encourages the best things to happen. So I think you do need some discretion, but I hate to make Houston the whipping boy, right?
Oh, go ahead.
But that's a place that doesn't have zoning. It doesn't have regulation, and it's not exactly the full flower of urbanism. So I think you need, to have these things. The greatest thing about Jane Jacobs is that her city was closely observed, intimately observed. Nobody comes into my office with anything but kind of that's a gross generalization, and for those of you who have been into my office, I apologize. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about those other people who aren't here. I mean, people are not coming in generally with a fine observation about the neighborhoods in which they're proposing to build, right? Now, the people who do have a fine observation are the ones who don't want anything to be built in their neighborhoods, and I do hear from them, and they do finely observe their neighborhoods. But the ones who are coming who want to build something, they don't know simple things like how many people do own vehicles there. So what's the appropriate level of parking, given that level of car ownership? They come in with national numbers, which are our rates of ownership are half of what the national numbers are in the city, and it varies from neighborhood to neighborhood. I mean, people aren't coming in with fine observations about how their building fits and how it contributes to what's needed and desired in a neighborhood. And often it's coming in at a scale that makes it hard to do these things, right? So I would say yes, in an ideal world, and if it was you, Bing, and it was a few other people who were coming in, yes, we could sit down like civilized people with neighbors and talk about what is the thing that would help to realize our collective aspirations. But unfortunately, that is just not how it's mostly being done, and even the people who say they want to do that, they point their fingers at the banks who won't finance it, or the retailer who just won't have it. You want that grocery store, you're going to have to provide this parking. So if I could get everybody in the room, that's the other thing, including the boogeymen that are not there, who are blamed for why they have to do this thing, that they don't really want to do, but and will not give us the desired outcome.
So I'd like to get back to this phrase that you just used, because I think it's key to everything, collective aspirations. I think that This city was built, I mean, every city is built on collective aspirations. New York City is built on our collective aspirations to make money. So that's why it's looking the way it is. I mean, and feeling the way it is. But this is built on our, Washington, D.C. is built on our collective aspirations to understand freedom in democratic government and to express it and to figure out how it represents us as a people. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people come here. But the other reason is the physical city. The physical city is really beautiful, and with all its parks and its statues and its circles and its beautiful historic buildings, it is, the physical city is an attraction itself. So let's talk about preservation in the urban form right now, because I think that we need new buildings, we need new expression. Without it, the city dies. And at the same time, we now have an enormous body of historic buildings that are fine buildings, that are reusable buildings, that maybe could be added to, or just like the Arena Theater area, Bing Thom has reworked that sacred Harry Weiss building that every architect is tearing its hair out about right now. So I think that let's talk about preservation in cities and how that works, because I think Jane Jacobs talked about the fabric of the built environment and the scale and the existing buildings and old buildings having new functions. Who would like to get into that issue of preservation? Let's start with Washington, D.C.
I mean, thank God. Thank God we have preservation. Thank God that we, I thank the people who came before, beginning with "Don't Tear It Down," who really created a very strong ethic of preservation in the city, and we have some of the wonderful mix of buildings because of that. Historic preservation has evolved in a lot of ways. I mean, I think the facadism that we practiced a couple of decades ago, we're not so fond of anymore. The very things that you mentioned about Washington are the things I call the federal things, the symbolism of the city, the institutions that are here. They also help to create a lot of pressure on the city, with more than 40% of the land in the city not on the tax rolls. And that means that, we have height limits, which is part of what makes our city so beautiful. But it means that we have to do more with the things that we have. I think it creates a potential shortage situation in all types of property, depending on where our future lies in terms of jobs and residents. But that mix of buildings, I think, is critically important. One of the most dreaded words in, I think, the human vocabulary, highest and best use. I think that people aren't, they're drawing the box too narrowly when they talk about something like that. The idea of there being kind of an ecosystem of what we would now call innovation, I don't think that's the word that Jane used, but that's the word we would use today, that be able to have creative new uses and have them afford to be there. Philippa Hughes is in the audience today, who's kind of one of our best purveyors in the city of putting innovative new uses into old and disused or underused spaces. I mean, that's a great thing to have in the city, and if you can't accommodate that, I think you are destined to a type of sterility, that is ultimately going to doom your economy. So I don't think that bigger picture we get when we draw the box around a single property, or even a single district and say, this is what we have to get out of it. I think we're neglecting the larger economy and that kind of creative ecosystem that makes a place vital. And it's not all about jobs even, or about what's the next big idea or the big invention. It's all kinds of creativity that add to the quality of the place and the quality of life. A lot of it artistic and creative and beautiful. That it's hard to put a dollar value on those things, but it makes us love our neighborhoods. It makes us love our city, when we have those things. And I think that that historic preservation is a big piece of that. And as a byproduct, almost an accidental byproduct of it, because we only preserve the worthy buildings. You know what I mean? Just because they're a certain age doesn't mean they're deserving of preservation. There has to be other things about them, whereas actually it's kind of useful to have even old, ugly buildings in the city, because the things that can happen inside those buildings that don't have to be so precious, those buildings don't have to be so meticulously preserved. Really exciting things can happen in those buildings.
So, Mr. Zuccotti, I mean, I think you're obviously in the business of building new. And what is a developer's relationship in New York and elsewhere, because you build all over the world, to historic preservation?
Okay, so here I would answer the question by taking the West Village as an illustration. If Jane Jacobs went back to the West Village today, she would, for the most part, see the same physical construction that existed in the 1950s, with some advantage that the Miller Highway is no longer there and there's access to the river for people who live there. And that was achieved essentially by two things. One was by the landmarking of a significant portion of the West Village, which meant there was no as-of-right solution. No clearance was available. The second advantage, in terms of preservation, was that most of the land was zoned manufacturing. And so, in order to secure a residential permit, you needed a zoning change. To get a zoning change, it gave the government an opportunity to decide what could actually be built on the site. So with some minor exceptions, if you went to that area, you would see infill housing, a project built that Jane Jacobs endorsed and fought for. It's one of the more successful infill projects in the United States, right in her general area. You wouldn't recognize it as being in scale a distortion from the existing scale. The second thing that happened was the conversion of many of the manufacturing and warehousing uses to residential use. Now, that was all done essentially because there were very few ways in which you could build a large office building or a residential building on an as-of-right basis. So I think preservation was advanced in that area because of the fact that there was limited, unregulated option for the developer.
Can
Now,
you explain the as-of-right, just so that some in the audience?
As-of-right means that the person could simply conform to the existing zoning ordinance and build according to what the existing zoning ordinance provided. Because of the landmark law, you can't do that, and because if you want to put residential into a converted building or tear down a warehouse that's manufacturing, you have to get a zoning change to provide residential use. But I want to make one point clear about all of these things that we're talking about. If she went back to that neighborhood today, she would see that the working class and even poor people who lived in that neighborhood are no longer there, and that their living option in that location no longer exists because of its success and because of its popularity, the square foot prices for condominiums range in the thousands of dollars. And my parents lived in a 5-story walk-up, I lived in it, where we paid $32 a month rent. So imagine the difference and the impact in my own lifetime of the possibility of poor or working class people to live in that neighborhood. It no longer exists. So that's the price that you have to keep in mind when we talk about preservation and enhancing these neighborhoods and restoring them. The question is, what do you do about affordable housing, and what do you do about making a neighborhood better so it becomes, quote unquote, more expensive, and limiting the economic options of the location.
So does anybody on the panel, and I'd be interested in when we open it up to the audience, is anybody doing that? In other words, making those not just mixed use, but mixed income neighborhoods and in modern cities. Those historic properties are incredibly choice pieces, as you mentioned. So, but then what happens to the working people? I mean, the working people support cities. How do we deal with this right now? And are we dealing with the issues of working people in mixed income, mixed use neighborhoods, if there are any such places?
Well, I think it's an extremely difficult problem because what's happened, I think, maybe prior to the 30s and the 40s, I think the issue of affordability comes about when people think about ownership more. There is rental affordability, but somehow the entitlement issue of ownership of your home, the idea of really the right to shelter is one thing, but the right to ownership for 3/4 of the world doesn't exist, and even for our forefathers. And so the whole issue of the home as a commodity, it's very bad in Vancouver because, you know, we have tremendous immigration coming in. We've never had a recession since the 1980s. And the issue is people are no longer buying a condominium as a home. They buy a condominium as a commodity of investment. And when you think about the fact that you can make more money when you're asleep than when you're awake doing your job, what does that do to all of us in our society? You know, I think there's some fundamental problems that we have to deal with now, where I do very few condominium buildings now because I'm not designing homes anymore. I'm just designing products to be flipped or to be resold some years later, and that's taken the pleasure out of building residential building out of my practice. But how to solve that? You know, as a young person, I went to Singapore in the 1970s when Lee Kuan Yew started the, you know, socialist government in Singapore, and turns out to be fascist because, you know, he just rammed it down everybody's throat, and you know, people were just evicted out of the kampongs and put into high buildings, and that's exactly what's happening in China. And so they've caught the North American bug big time, and they're going to have tremendous amount of social unrest. I think it is starting now, and it's going to grow because this problem of ownership has become a business. You know, it's no longer something that you want to shelter for your family.
So, Harriet, as a planner, I mean, you must be confronted with all of this all the time.
I mean, I think it kind of goes back to something that Bing said earlier about regulation. Think about when this book was written. In many ways, cities were not on the ascendancy, right? They were beginning their long decline. The suburbs were on the ascendancy, and that the demand, where it was growing in the suburbs, and people were leaving the cities. And so the pressure, you know, on housing prices, you know, just wasn't the same as it is now. You know, we could talk about, I mean, this could be an interesting conversation that we could go on for a long time about ownership and a winner-take-all society. But if you compare the economy in the United States today to the 1960 economy, there were so many more thriving cities and towns and places. There are so many fewer places now that are thriving, that are growing. There are bigger places clustered mostly around the coasts, but a lot of places that are failing. So the challenge is for the places that are thriving, you have to regulate in order to get affordability. You have to plan for it and do it deliberately and consciously and in specific places near transit in order to have any hope of having that kind of a mixed income society. And if you leave it to the market or leave it to chance or hope that it happens in a city that's growing, it's not going to happen. So that's a place where I think regulation has a really important role, and that we need to have a more common understanding about the collective benefits of having a mix of incomes in our neighborhoods. You know, that it's a good thing, not a bad thing, even though suburbs are built as economic monoliths. You know, the difference between a $280,000 townhouse and a $250,000 townhouse is enough to get people, you know, up in arms. They don't want that low-income housing in their neighborhood. You know, that kind of economic stratification is inappropriate for cities, and we shouldn't have it.
So is the idea of collective aspirations gone? I mean, have we lost it and we just sort of one for himself and nothing for all? I mean, what culture have we built here that we need to get to the next level in order to inject the humanity at every level and not just for those who can afford it?
Bing is right. It comes from dialogue. I mean, people have, you know, they have interests in different spheres. There's their themselves, there's their family, there's their neighborhood, there's their city, there's their nation. They have different roles. They're fathers and mothers, they're citizens, they're voters, they're parents, they're whatever they are. But you have to engage them, you know, in those different roles and develop a set of shared expectations. The fact that I know that my neighbor has an expectation or an aspiration that our neighborhood be clean, you know, makes me want to pick up the litter more. That you develop that social fabric by having those interactions, and that's one of the greatest functions of a city. It brings people together. The city itself is civilizing if, you know, it's the kind of city that Jane Jacobs described, where people meet on the street, where they have a lot of casual interactions, where they build those social bonds that are absolutely essential. I mean, they're essential for our civilization, not just for how successful a given neighborhood is. So, you know, I feel lucky every day to be in this city, but to be able to be involved in any way in an occupation that forwards, you know, the purpose of cities.
Well,
So-
I'm personally very optimistic because when I see a crowd like this on a Sunday morning wanting to talk about these issues, I think the recession that you know we are in and have been in, it's causing us to rethink a lot. And when we look at what's happening in other parts of the world, where, you know, we're talking about gigantium cities now of 30 million, 40 million. I mean, the urbanization that's happening everywhere. And so in North America, we still have breathing space to rethink and reinvigorate. And I think there will be a period where we will rebuild largely our cities. I think the Jane Jacob issues about the freeway battles, that's still going on, right? And I'm optimistic that this corner is going to be turned because of what's happening with the whole environmental issues. And the younger generation, it's happening in the schools. I think the young kids are now really well taught about the issues that Jane Jacobs talk about. And I think a new generation will come about. And I think these kind of issues that we've been struggling will continue to be struggled with. But I think it's going to gain, I personally think it'll be a new momentum that's going to come.
I agree with that, but I also think that when we talk about the young generation coming up with their ability to deal with technology, community building, all of those things that they do so well, and environmentalism, then we take the pressure off of ourselves because we're saying, okay, the future will work itself out. I don't want us to do that. I want us to face the issues now with whatever we can do. And so my question is, the next one is, so we talked a little bit about preservation, but the growth issue becomes really interesting here in Washington, D.C., because you have enormous activity here. I mean, you know, coming in on the train, being around town, cranes everywhere. This is like Crane City. It's like they're going to just fly all over the place, which is fantastic. And I'm really happy to see that because I love to see wealth and health and development and progress. But is it? And how is that working for Washington, D.C., this sort of new phase of real estate development? And does that include some of the Jane Jacobs ideals? Your mic.
Sorry. I should take this other thing off. All right. I think that it's the reaction to it is mixed. And that we're kind of we haven't been in this position where we've been a growing place in decades and decades. And so it's a bit of a shock to the system, I think, and that the demographics here are changing very rapidly. A lot more young people, a lot more diversity. We're losing our African American majority, which has been the case in this city since 1970. So those things, I think, are very, very unsettling for people. But we don't have the China problem. No American city does. That the scale at which cities are being created and built is so overwhelming that the kinds of things that are talked about here just can't be in those places. We are building still at a pretty small scale. We have some exceptions. The old convention center site, there are some large projects that are going on in the city, but even those are very deliberately attempting to mix uses, have active street lives, bring new connectivity to those places, restore connectivity that was taken away by the previous uses. So I think that it's going to be a tough road for the city for a while to kind of reconcile ourselves to being in this position as opposed to the place where it was hard to get something to happen here. And I think that we have the right to be much more demanding and much more selective about what is worthy of our neighborhoods than we have been in the past. But I think we also have to acknowledge that that we don't have the historic level of population in many cities and many neighborhoods, and the vitality that we long for on those commercial streets needs to have more people in those places in order to have that vitality. And that hopefully can be accommodated almost exclusively at transit sites and along transit corridors. But I think even that for some people is disquieting.
So those cranes that I'm seeing, are they all near transit corridors, or are they like parking
Yes.
garages, or what?
No,
What's okay?
they're all on transit. I mean, I can't think of a major project. I mean, we're blessed with a lot of transit, and we're adding more. We have a plan to bring 37 miles of streetcar to the city, which will triple the number of residents within a quarter mile of rail. So, I mean, for us, we can be pretty much exclusively on transit. I can think of one site, Walter Reed, that's a big redevelopment site in the city. I don't know yet what it's going to be, but that isn't currently served by transit, but even that site is on a proposed streetcar line.
Okay. So that's really very encouraging. So, Mr. Zuccotti, the development in New York, I mean, we still see very few cranes except for downtown and maybe some in Queens. In New York City, it still doesn't feel healthy to me. I mean, you'll tell us what you think is going on in real estate, but what are the demographics that you're building for? What's coming? I mean, we're being told that 1 million more people will arrive in New York City. I mean, we're going to be standing on each other's shoulders if 1 million more people arrive. So what are you working with? What sort of demographic are you working with for New York City?
Well, actually, from an economic point of view, New York City is the most successful place in the country right now. Vacancy rates are the lowest. And on the whole, the economy in New York has weathered the current situation reasonably well. It's not likely that anyone will be building major office buildings for some time. And I think that's a result of the current economic circumstances, and it's going to take a while for that to change. But you put your finger on something that's very important. The future of what drives the economy of the city of New York are two things. First, and I have been pitching New York all my life, pitching it as a government official and pitching it as the seller of commercial office space. And everybody I talk to would say to me privately, the captains of industry, we've taken everybody out of New York that we can take out. We're stuck here. And why is that? That's because of the labor supply. Because they can get the people they need to work more easily than they can if they're dispersed in other areas, particularly suburban areas. And that's particularly true today because of the fact that they can draw from young people who are highly educated, and in fact, those people are the people that American Express and Chase and the technology people are looking for. They come to New York because they want to be there to live, family formation much later in life than it was years ago, and the companies are able to hire them. But there's a second element, and this is what's fired the New York City economy since its beginning, and that is immigration. And that immigration offers all kinds of entry-level jobs at low wages, comparatively low wages, and that also has fired the economy. I mean, it wasn't more than 30 years ago that there was a phrase among certain groups in planning that I didn't believe in. It was called planned shrinkage. And that concept was that we should close out some of our schools and close down the subway station in East New York because our population was going to go to 6 million people. And as you said, it's going to approach 9 million people. And those 9 million people are people coming into the city from all over the world. Korea, China, Latin America, Romania, Russia. And those people bring their drive for success, their willingness to work, and their willingness to create. And that's what makes New York successful. So, sure, we'll have 9 million people, and it may get crowded, but it's the land of opportunity, and that's what the secret of the success of the city is.
It's a great pep talk, but I love it because I feel the same way, but I think that it's really also very interesting that when we talked about the car culture being sold to Americans, powerful PR and advertising, and New York has powerful PR and advertising. I mean, 5 out of 10 movies are made there romanticizing the city. There are very few American cities, even though those films are made in Toronto, because New York no longer has those areas.
The reason for that is it used to be less expensive in Toronto. It isn't anymore, though.
Okay, so we're opening up the questions to the audience. Scott has a mic. There's a hand up there.
Thank you. Jane Jacobs talks about seemingly approvingly of living within a distance of the sidewalk vertically so that you could shout and be heard. Another way to characterize that might be to live within tree leaf distance of the sidewalk. Here in Washington, D.C., this city is different from every city in North America only because of the height limitation. So now I hear rumors in the paper of reopening the discussion about height limitation. I'd be interested to hear from any of you about the goodness or not goodness of living higher than that part of what Jane Jacobs had to say.
The goodness or not goodness, I love living higher. I love being up there, but there needs to be a street life. That's the whole point, yeah.
Well, my own personal preference is living at a West Village scale of life. I moved to Brooklyn because in Brooklyn, the principles that Jane Jacobs, you can find neighborhoods that are exactly just still today, exactly the way that are sustained by these principles. But people do like to live in high buildings, and you can't have eyes in the street if you live on the 50th story of the Trump Tower, the story of the Trump Tower. The bottom line, though, is it's different strokes for different folks. Planners can't put themselves and say, we know how to do it. We know that everything in here is right in every situation. The world isn't the West Village or the North End of Boston or Seattle's C District or San Francisco. We have to have a society where planners can plan for different tastes and different choices. including the automobile. And so there won't be any eyes on the street from Trump Tower, that's for sure. They'll have to come up with other forms of security. But
They can afford to lock themselves away.
but that's the nature of a free society.
There's a, Scott, where are you?
Can
Yeah,
I
go ahead.
say just something quick about it? I think that the wonderful thing about the height limit in the city is that it's all about creating a human-scaled environment. So the height limit isn't based on the height of the Capitol or the height of the Washington Monument. It's based on the width of the street, so that you have a relationship between that most public of spaces, the street, that's our living room, and the height of buildings. Now, this exact relationship, which is, the width of the street plus, 20 feet or 10 feet is not necessarily the magic relationship, but having the relationship is really important. I think part of the reason this comes up so perennially in Washington is that this is a federal height limit. This is not a limit that the city sets for itself, and that rankles in a city that would like to govern itself. So we'd love to be able to set our own height limit and not have it be a function of the federal government, but I think the city will always have a height limit. I don't know if it'll be what it is today, but I think we'll always have one.
Okay. Mike.
Yeah, I just had a question, and of course this is a fantasy too, so you have to forgive me a little bit. I'm an original tenant of Battery Park City in downtown New York, and I lived there. I was very young then, but I lived there, and I thought it was an incredible advancement over what was preceding whatever was there, which I guess was just a bunch of piers. Because I was able to live a kind of vertical commute. I went down 27 floors on my elevator, went across 5 blocks, and I went up 61 floors to my office at 40 Wall Street. And so I thought it was like almost a sci-fi fantasy to be able to live like that. And it was good for children. I mean, it was like, because like some of the guys I worked with, they had little kids that were toddlers, and they'd crawl around on the promenade, and it was nice, and I could go take the Staten Island ferry, on the weekends, and I mean, it was amazing. But the problem was the vertical thing. It really bothered me, and that Equitable building, that was like something from like an Orwellian nightmare. So what I thought when I looked out my window on the 27th floor, I would look down about 5 floors, and there were these guys with these terraces they had, in Battery Park, and I was thinking, yeah, I could shout down to that guy, and it was very cool. So what I would like would be for them to say, okay, you can build, 50-story high residentials, but you got to have setback and terraces so you can always shout down, and you should put a sidewalk down like every 5 floors, and you'd have these incredible promenades at like 37th floor promenades, and I had to take an express elevator anyway to get up to my office, and why not just zone it so the express elevator stopped at the 37th floor promenade, and everybody gets out, and they have this incredible walk. It would be like Skyline Drive, but kind of like the Manhattan version, Anyway, there's my fantasy.
I love that. Let's hope that Mr. Zuccotti's listening to this one. There's that young man over there, the next generation wants to speak.
Well, I have a question. I've been to Vancouver, and I'm just wondering, especially Bing, because you do a lot of work in Canada, what is your view on public transportation? Because around here we have the subway, but over there they have a sort of SkyTrain, and it's computer-driven. And I think that was just so amazing and great, because you could get on the train, get off at Waterfront, and walk maybe even 5 miles to anywhere you want to go. And it was just so efficient for the community and so easy to be transported. Now we get our new subway and expanding where I live in Northern Virginia. They're going above ground, but that's not always such a good thing. Because like I said, in Vancouver, you want to have public transportation, but you don't want it to barge into community life. However, the SkyTrain, they put one of the subway stops right in the middle of a road right by Tyson's 2, and it's like the worst possible place for a subway station. It's one of the most dangerous roads.
Would you like a job?
You're hired.
But anyway, it's one of the most dangerous roads. And just the fact of thousands of people getting off of the subway and crossing that road, there's no crosswalks, and people are getting right on to the Beltway in 66. Hopefully there will be. But that's just my question, Bing. What's your view on that?
Whoa. Wow.
I think transit is really the only solution to solve some of the problems we have in American cities, right? And I think it's going to come just because of scarcity of resources. But to provide a variety of modes for people to travel is very important. I think it's the range of variety that allows people choice. You have this wonderful bike sharing program here that's the envy of the nation, right? And that's wonderful. And I think in any city that when we talk about now, the important thing is there are no magic one-liner solutions. You know, I think the important thing is to have the courage to experiment again. You know, in some way, coming from the outside, you know, America has been number one for many decades. And there's good things and bad things about being number one, because once you've been number one, you begin to become fearful of change. And I think America now has this chance to really reinvigorate itself, because the world is changing so fast now. The playing field is very level now. And actually, when it becomes level, you will become more invigorated again. You don't feel you have this big weight on your shoulder to solve all the problems of the world. There will be other people coming forward to help solve the problems of the world. And in America, the one thing we have to remember is you have many more shrinking cities than growing cities. And I think going back to what John said, this may seem a little bit far-fetched, but I think the next problem of the next few decades, it's going to be population movement. When you look at what's happening in Europe, you're looking at what's happening in the world, North America is still the most desirable place to come to. And certainly we see this in Canada. I mean, our immigration quota has now just been doubled. Because if we don't double our immigration quota, we can't replace ourselves. And the same thing's going to happen in the United States. And in the future of American cities, sure, New York will always be fine, Washington will probably be fine. But when you think of the majority of the cities in the United States, if you don't massively increase your immigration, and that's your salvation, because all that new people will come and bring new energy to your country and give you a chance to regrow again. Otherwise, you are going to completely shrink at a very, very rapid rate.
There's also the other issue is that American cities are looking at themselves smaller, mid-sized cities, smaller cities are very serious about building their own location and building their own resources, Nashville and Cincinnati. And I mean, really, really interesting work going on elsewhere. So it's not, we're not isolated. This is a nationwide movement, and very Jacobsian, actually.
Well, you have to come back to ask the question, what is an honest day's work anymore? The economy has become in such a way that there are so many shortcuts that, you know, what is an honest day's work? And I think that's what's going to have to come back to think about, you know.
Last question, then we'll have some closing thoughts.
We live in Baltimore and in the city, and a block away from where we live is a building that was built at the early 1900s for the Masons, and it was built to their needs. And it's a Latrobe building, isn't it? Latrobe. So it's quite a big, beautiful building. A couple of years ago, we in the neighborhood heard that the Masons were wanting to sell. Their organization was shrinking. They couldn't afford the space anymore. Most of their people lived out in the suburbs, and they wanted to sell this beautiful building. So everybody, and myself included, right away, knee-jerk reaction was, let's get this on the historic preservation list so that it can't be torn down if they sold it to somebody to tear it down, which ultimately did happen. It did get on the list. But in thinking about it, before it actually got on the list, I began to realize that the Masons back in the 1900s built this building for themselves. They paid for it. They chose their architect. They chose the design. And who are we really to take away their right to sell their building and move on? And now, because it has this historic preservation criteria, for them to find a buyer for this building that doesn't have the parking for a big use for later, it's going to be very hard. And so then they're stuck with this building. And I'm just wondering about sort of the ethical side of that.
Well, maybe it doesn't need parking.
No, it does. That's not the way Baltimore is. It doesn't have transit. It doesn't have facilities, and it's a large.
Okay.
I think that becomes a question that's as much about the economy of the city. I used to live in Baltimore, in Bolton Hill, not too far from, I think, where you're talking about. I absolutely hear what you're saying, and that if you look at the long sweep of history, if you look at a city like London, that's kind of been built over and over again, New York, over and over again, that you would say to yourself that it's natural that cities evolve and change. In the district, I think it's probably true in Baltimore, that just because a building gets designated doesn't mean it can't be altered, doesn't mean it can't even be torn down in the right circumstances. What it requires is a much, admittedly, more difficult, more time-consuming, more costly process that really considers the building, what could be done with it. You know, the time gives more potential buyers maybe the opportunity to think about what they might be able to do. I'd hate to think about what Baltimore would be like without its fabulous architecture. I mean, Mount Vernon Square alone, you know. But I think historic preservation is a process as much as it is the absolute hermetic sealing of any given building, you know, exactly the way it is.
It doesn't allow for the dialogue.
I think it does, and in our city, sometimes the historic preservation, I won't call the threat of listing, I will call it the eligibility for historic preservation before a building even gets listed, sometimes means working out an agreement up front about what alterations might occur and might determine whether or not the building ultimately gets listed. So it's certainly used here as a tool to have that dialogue, and I know when I ran the state planning agency in Maryland for a while, that there definitely was dialogue around potential listing, but I think a lot of it depends on the economy and whether or not there are, you know, lots of buyers who want to take on, which is inevitably a potentially more expensive process that when it involves a historic building.
So I think we're about to be asked to wrap up, and I think as you see the conversation goes on, I mean, just even with this one building that you're talking about, the fact that we actually have preservation laws in place and that we're not destroying our heritage is already a huge win for our society. So I think it's really important. Some of the issues that Jane Jacobs brought up really did reshape us. So I think if you haven't read the books, or at least one book, I recommend that you do, because it's really an eye-opener, and it's still as fresh and as interesting as it was then. And we all have her to thank for some humane portion of our cities right now. I'm not sure what would have happened if her adversary, Robert Moses, had won everything. He's won a lot of things. He's won a lot of things, and you know something, what he's done is really incredible. Some of it is horrible. But so everybody has contributed something to our current situation, and I think it's up to us to take these lessons and move on and use them for the benefit of the people who live in our cities and ourselves. So that sort of winds us down. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much, Susan.
Thank you. You were wonderful. Thank you.